Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Welcome back for another episode of Things Hidden, our podcast that explores anthropology in relation to current events and looks at the different intersection of news and mythology and biblical text. And I'm joined by a returning guest, someone who has also got a keen interest in these subjects and has his own unique angle on it. He's an action designer. He's also a podcast host himself, where he examines the role of action and violence. And he's got a new book coming out called The Art of Violence. Eric Jacobus, how you doing, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me, David.
It's great having you back. You know, you sent me this piece at your website, ericjacobus.com, The Art of Violence. And it's an attempt, you say, to derive a scientific method for action design. So let's just kind of break this down. First of all, what's action design?
Well, if choreography is planned movement, then fight choreography is planned violence. So what I want to be able to do is choreograph violence in a way that's realistic, meaningful, and brings a deeper level of understanding to storytelling and all this.
And you do this. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you do action design for, so people kind of know where you're coming from with this?
Yeah, some recent titles would be God of War Ragnarok, Mortal Kombat 1. I mostly work on video games now at my studio. We motion capture here, and I'll
Now, how do
perform
you
an
jump
action
as high
design.
as Mario? Are you doing that? Are you capturing Mario's jumps? Is that you?
Oh yeah, that you have to eat a lot of mushrooms for that. And so a lot of my process involves, trying to understand the story and intention behind action. And I always, my mentor, Clayton Barber, told me, you always start from story, and everything starts with story, and then everything else kind of falls into place from there.
Okay.
And, starting from story is critical. And then understanding also how those kind of, how the water flows down the mountain, so to speak, right? How violence actually works, how it actually becomes person-on-person conflict. And that's something that I think it's a question that I ask every time I'm going to choreograph one punch, right? It's like, why do this punch? And then how are you going to do it? How are you going to move into it? What does your face look like? A lot of it's acting. A lot of action design, in my view, is not even fighting. I think a lot of action design, I think Oppenheimer has some of the best action design in history. And there's no fight scene in that movie. But the main character, who plays Oppenheimer, he's carrying something on his back, and you can see it through the whole movie. And that is the threat of global nuclear warfare. And if you just move through a world and you can kind of show the real threat in that way, I think that you've done your job. You don't even need to throw punches at that point.
Yeah.
But that's how I view action design, is that it needs to come from this, this higher level story and what exactly is the overall action threat, which I call the aggression kernel. And then that all goes downstream into the movement.
What's the aggression kernel? What is that? Tell us a little bit.
The aggression kernel is the current highest threat level that we know.
Right.
And you have eras that transition. We have, eras in history where we transition from stone to bronze to iron to gunpowder to nuclear. Those are sort of the big ones. Obviously, there are small ones in between. Probably stirrups on a horse was another one, but like the big ones, as soon as a people become aware that there's a new aggression kernel in town, right? Like I just read about the end of the Bronze Age. If you're in a town and you're realizing now that chariots can't fight against this new horde of enemies coming in with like these new swords, then everybody has this like operating system update. It's like automatic, and it changes you immediately. You're going to move your home. You're going to change how you farm. You're going to change how you do your rituals. Everything suddenly changes. Your kinship systems are going to change. And so I think that those sort of kernels are, a lot of the time, those are sort of at the base of a lot of human behavior. And they sort of define an era. They define the morals, the ethics, they define the economy.
Right.
And, perhaps this is a bias on my part because I'm an action designer. I tend to see violence as preceding most of these things, but I think that's what makes me a Girardian in a lot of ways too, which is that if you understand violence as a founding principle among people, then, that can be applied then to action design. If the violence of the world that you're in the story, if that's sort of the canvas that you're painting in, then, whatever you paint in there is going to be true, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's, when you talk about the kernel of aggression, that sounds familiar to me. I've referenced the book, The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson, who I've had on the program, and he talks about the logic of violence and the dance between violence and technology and culture. He references, and one I like to reference a lot is how the invention of the musket allowed for the peasant farmer in America to have some kind of a fighting chance against the sovereign king and of the greatest empire. And that kind of changed the dynamic by which America could have a different relationship to its sovereign to some extent than other previous iterations. Is that the same kind of framework you're talking about here?
Pretty much. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Iron Age, right? Where, the Iron Age made warfare the everyday business of every man. Whereas the Bronze Age, it was like more of an elite issue, right? Chariots were much more important. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that the second that iron comes about, you have this aggression kernel, right? Because iron was around for a long time. It's not really until you have like a specific kind of iron weapon, and there are certain other things that come into place. A big enough iron forge, a big enough group of people, a lot of things sort of have to fall into place. But then there's a moment, and that moment is this sudden shift. Right, because you can sort of imagine it as this like this curve, right? You have a lot of iron that's kind of going around being used for farming implements, and then at a certain point you have the horde of people that are able, 10,000 men armed with these iron swords, or even like if they're bronze swords that are shaped in a new way. But the iron swords in particular were a lot cheaper. They're more durable. They wouldn't when you sharpen them, they wouldn't wear down as easily. That's this like shelling point almost where things suddenly turn. And I don't think that there's anything that pushes an operating system update faster than a new kind of warfare. I think that that's what changes things the quickest. And there are a lot of things that go into that. And then once that hits, then like everything else comes out of it.
So what are we in now? What's the kernel of aggression in our world today? Is it this information war that people talk about, the AI, or something else?
Maybe. I know people talk about how they're concerned about AI, but I think that they're more concerned about AI online. I think at some point, maybe when AI becomes, such a problem that you can't even use your credit card safely anywhere. And that's not the case right now, right? It's mostly safe to use your credit card. It's mostly safe to be online. If at some point it just becomes unsafe to do any of that stuff, then that might be the next one. I don't think we're quite there. I think we're still sort of, in the nuclear because look at what's going on with Russia. We don't really talk about firearms too much when it comes to Russia. Like the higher level threat is still nukes, but we're not quite at the stage where there's some other like new technology, the tic tac phenomenon and whatnot, where we're going to start using new physics to make nukes less useful, and now we have a far more powerful weapon that's going to become like the new aggression kernel. And we're not there though. Like once we have it, we'll know. There will be no question. As there was no question when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima, there was just no more question.
You're talking about the Tic Tacs. You're talking about the little UAPs that people don't.
Yeah. Did I say TikTok? I meant Tic Tac. TikTok's its own problem.
Yeah. These Tic Tacs, these are like these little things that are appearing by nuclear bases and shutting down nukes when they're doing a test and stuff. So is that the new aggression kernel, or is that the non-aggression kernel?
I don't think it is yet, because I don't think that that's like posing any serious threat right now.
Right.
When it's demonstrated that those are the actual new threat, we will know. This is not like, again, when it happens, everybody knows. Everybody will get the
thing. It's not a technical on the margins thing. It's when it's become the dominant concern for social.
Yeah, I mean, like it's kind of like when you read about Spiritism in the late 1800s, right? And Spiritism and this, the seances and mediums and Leonora Piper and whatnot, like that. This was coming kind of at the same time as the telegraph, right? And the telegraph is sort of, this new way of transferring technology and transferring information long distance without a wire. It's a big deal, right? Using first a wire and then radio. And there is some sort of like correlation between like the latest level of technology and like what our current like spiritual fad it might be.
Yeah.
And so I think that the nuclear age has still left this impression upon us that nowhere in the world is safe anymore, and that we can destroy the world, and we need an answer from the outside. And so that's why that when you have a very obvious aggression kernel like nuclear power, then you just immediately have sci-fi films where aliens come in, they tell us how to live, right? Like the not Plan 9 from Outer Space. What was it? Day the Earth Stood Still, right?
Yeah, because you can't think of anything else bigger than that to stop.
Exactly. So now it's flying saucers, but in the late 1800s, it was, how do we explain telepathy? How do we explain mind reading? How do we explain these mediums that are going around? But that's because telegraphy was kind of the hot thing at the time. And industrialization in general was sort of like, you could argue that industrialization itself and mechanization is an aggression kernel, but I think that that's just sort of like out of the gunpowder kernel, somewhere on that curve. Yeah. The gunpowder, like like you were mentioning, the muskets, that was like definitely the big one. But gunpowder had been around for 500 something years before then, right? Nobody was thinking of using it to send people might have been thinking about it, but iron warfare was good enough at the time, and cavalries were good enough. And then when you start sending projectiles using gunpowder, especially if it's handheld, then that's that point. And then everybody knows it immediately. Every town knows, okay, well, now our fortifications are kind of useless. These certain structures are useless. These kinds of governments are useless now, and things change very quickly. And I think that when that happens, we will know it. And I don't know if it's going to be the Tic Tac. It might be AI. It might be new physics that takes us to Mars, some new technology that gets us to Mars that's very productive. And the thing that gets us to Mars really quickly happens to be the thing that you can build the Death Star with. We don't know. I don't think our problems are going to go away when we go to Mars. I think it'll get worse.
Right. That's kind of the, it's very similar to McLuhan's ideas of these media ecology effects of, how these things, these different technologies affect and extend our senses and how we relate to one another, and I think that is something that people need to take into consideration much more seriously. So going back to the premise of this piece on your website, The Art of Violence, you want to derive a scientific method. So you defined action design as kind of an expansive form of choreography, right? Kind of taking it into more of a holistic approach. Why do we need a scientific method for action design?
Well, I don't know if it's like a public need to have action design.
Yeah.
My journey has been, I just want to get better at my job.
Right.
And then what I happened upon were, various theories about violence that when you take little pieces from them, a lot of the theories on violence are, well, long story short, I wanted to come up with a theory on violence so that I could design better, right? And this was sort of just a pet theory of mine for a long time. And to me, it was just like a way to have seminars at potential clients, studios, and whatnot. But then once my business partner and I, once we started actually putting it down on paper and analyzing it, it seemed as though there was a hole in the market, not just of action designers that theorize about violence, but there's actually not really anybody theorizing about violence from the perspective of violence. And this is where the kernel of the theory is that the unique brand of violence that humans have, and no animal has violence. Animals have combat. Humans have violence. Animals have combat, which is optimized for their hierarchy. It's optimized because they don't destroy themselves with it. There's something about humans, though, where our combat can kill us very easily. Happens all the time. With animals, it almost never happens. And what is it exactly about human violence that does that? It's our propensity, it's our capacity to use objects for aggression. Object-based aggression is something that we have a monopoly on. No other animal has this. Mm-hmm. And the fact that when we enter into some kind of violent scenario as people, we have no idea what the other person's access to violence is. So if my hands are behind my back, you don't know what I have. All you can sort of do is like hypothesize based on my body language, how I entered the room, where I came from. There's all these things, and I'm going to be doing the same for you. That's what makes it recursive. It's this sort of anticipation, this shared moment of anticipation between us. That's our mirror neuron system sort of reading each other's body language and all the gestures. And this might have been what happened at the beginning before there was even verbal language. Mm-hmm. And then the hypothesis that I'm building is that scenario, which is unoptimized, that is the wellspring of language. That's where language comes from. You don't have language outside of that. So if you were to somehow, get rid of the human's capacity for using a gun, right? Like not just physically, but even mentally. Like if you couldn't even imagine the idea of object-based aggression, I don't think you could imagine grammar. I don't think you could imagine language. I think that language is a product of our capacity for object-based aggression. And so if that's true, which I'm staking, my career basically on the fact that it is, then art is within that, right? So art is kind of made within the boundaries of violence. So violence is sort of, ultimately what sets the whole field. It sets the stage to allow for language and art and even combat leagues, right? Like anything, like human aggression is still set within the confines of actual violence because you have actual violence, language, and then language sets the confines for sports, and even the Geneva Conventions now and laws of war now are actually set within language, right? And so in terms of like what is actual violence, like we don't really even see it very much except for these freak videos on YouTube where people just act without outside of the law, or when people break international law, invading other countries illegally and all that. So that was when that started emerging. I thought, okay, well, this actually might be useful outside of action design, but it's still being written within this sort of context of here's an action designer. As an action designer, I test everything daily with my audience, and here's this thing I came up with. Let's see if it holds water.
Right. So so is it when you say it permeates the foundations of all of our grammar and language? Is that kind of a scapegoat mechanism, generative anthropology kind of move you're making there? Or is there a distinction? Or, because it's, Girard would say that, for example, that the first symbolic, the first symbol is the scapegoat, right? It's the first representation, and I know I'm not as familiar with generative anthropology, but I know that it's kind of a similar concept there. How do you situate what you're doing in that conversation?
Well, I've presented at the generative anthropology conferences a couple times now and worked through this theory with them. And one of the things that kept on haunting me about the originary hypothesis within generative anthropology, which is based on mimetic theory, and it's very similar. It's just that the founding event in generative anthropology does not have to be a human sacrifice. It's actually agnostic as to what this is. All that needs to happen at the originary event is the first sign, whatever that is, right? And Girard kind of says the same thing, right? The first symbol. It's just that in Girardian thinking, it's that it has to be a human victim, sort of like the requirement. Within GA, this first sign that's emitted, the hypothesis is that there are enough people around some kind of central object. It might be a carcass, for example. And Eric Gans thinks that it's an animal carcass, and that the threat of all-out war between all people in the periphery around this carcass requires that somebody emit the first sign, so that there's not all-out warfare, and that allows the first. That's the first sign, and then that is the first time that you have like the division of the spoils in an egalitarian way, and so you have the founding of egalitarian human society, which is kind of like a redundancy. What the thing that I always had an issue with that hypothesis is that there is nothing in there that states why it is that these people have a moment of crisis. Why is it that when humans gather around a carcass, let's say that we're at the proto-human stage, no language, no nothing, we're just still kind of animals, right? Australopithecus, or maybe we're still chimps. I don't know what that Rubicon was exactly. Let's say we're all at that stage. What is it that forces the operating system update in this situation, whereas in all the other situations in history for 5 million years, when chimps gather around a carcass, why have they not emitted the first sign? That's my question. Like, why hasn't there been a sacrificial victim, so to speak, or why hasn't there been a first sign among any animals? Even when those animals do scapegoat, like you see, there are videos of chimps that gang up on another chimp and they kill them, right? This happens. Chimps do this, rats do this. Animals do this. Animals also scapegoat. What makes humans different? And this hypothesis is just like a very simple mechanical explanation, which is that it's our ability to use object-based aggression. That is what separates us. And the transformation of the object of aggression into a sign, into language, that is where the Rubicon, I would argue that the Rubicon is crossed at the moment that you're able to use objects for aggression. But in order to stay alive, you have to have language. You have to actually be able to escape the unoptimized combat scenario where everyone is going to die. And therefore, that situation requires language. It requires the sign. And that language can be gestural, right? It doesn't have to be like verbal.
The first image that came to mind was Christ speaking with a sword coming out of his mouth, right? It's kind of interesting there, in that image representation.
Yeah. If you think of it in terms of just that's a perfect description, right? Isn't that from Jeremiah or Micah when he quoted that?
There's several passages that refer to Jesus with a sword coming out of his mouth, but yeah, I think it's a prophecy in the Old Testament, and then Revelation talks about it, the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. And
yeah, and what the thing too is that I think that this idea that violence is what frames language, I don't think it's surprising to most people. Whenever I've sort of like field tested it with people, but people who live close to violence, if you live in a bad neighborhood, you sort of like implicitly understand this. You just don't really put words to it, right? This idea that language is sort of like dependent upon violence, right? It's like
how is that?
Well, your speech is going to be dictated by whatever the aggression kernel is. Right. That shared moment of anticipation that you have with the guy on a subway is going to determine your language. Yeah. It's not the other way around.
But how does that translate to language when everybody's having win-win situations and romance, love, intimacy, those things that are completely devoid of violence?
Yeah. So the beautiful thing about language is that that very base violence that I'm talking about, that's like right at the surface. If you think of object-based aggression as the magma that flows under the world, right? This sort of like base language that I'm talking about is like we're sitting right on top of that. It's where you're the closest to it. It's the ghetto. It's the inner city where you're on the subway with shady people. It's these kids that just have to try and escape to the boxing gym to just get away from the drug
It's
lords,
on the
right?
margins of sociality where you don't.
Yeah, and then the goal is always to try and get like up a level, and that level is not like, this is not a normative statement. Like everybody wants to get away from that magma as much as possible. There is probably an argument that it produces a high because it kind of like tunes you into like who people actually are, right? Because when you're down there, you really see who people are. That's when you really know somebody is like, what are they going to do when faced with life and death situations, right? That's when you really know somebody, right? You can be all talk, but then, like Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So there is this sort of, paradox between like when you're down there, people really well. But the goal is to try and get out of that so that you can have a family, so that you can, live in peace. And what language allows us to do is it's this sort of layer, right? Because you can keep reusing symbols wherever you go. You don't have to like remake the language every time you enter into this unoptimized scenario. You just use the language from other people, and the more you use it, the higher up you can go, the more you can sort of protect yourself from that magma. And so if you imagine like the university is sort of like on the highest level, separated from that magma of object-based aggression. And so within the university system,
It
and
used to be.
churches
Now
and
it's starting
whatnot.
to get a little bit more dicey.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like as an ideal though,
Yeah.
right? Is
Yeah.
is the idea is that like this is a highly linguistic institution. And that and other institutions include love within marriage. Love within marriage is like it is kind of old, but I would say that probably the first marriages were much more contract based. There was a lot more bridal capture back in the day. A lot of it was just arrangement. A lot of it was predicated less on conjugality, much more on contract and inheritance, right? And that doesn't mean that it was bad, but we have a very linguistic kind of love now compared to what it used to be, right? And so I would just say that the more that you utilize language within the framework of violence, the more that you use language, the more that you defer violence, and the more you can continue using more and more language and kind of work yourself up. The paradox is that if you work yourself too high up, you start to think that you're actually not founded upon violence anymore. And that's where we are right now. And we've been this way for a while, I think, because when you get so smart, when you get so damn smart that you actually think that I'm actually like outside of violence now, you're just deluded. I think you're just like deeper in the matrix than anybody else. Because again, you're built on a foundation that can be knocked out from underneath you, as it always does, as always happens.
So, what happens in language when it starts to get dysfunctional and relationships across the culture are starting to contagiously break down in a similar fashion as we see today with the war between the sexes and the war between racial groups and all this stuff, where there's what we generally would say we're losing our high trust society and we're becoming more and more dysfunctional and being able to mediate our differences. What's going on there? Is that a breakdown on language ability to maintain and sublimate that violent current that's at the bottom layer?
I don't know if language is the issue. I think that the mechanisms that we have in place that actually transmit language might be the issue. Because I've noticed that one of the reasons I got off of social media is that, just to apply this theory to a Facebook post, for example, if you say on Facebook, if you were to say something like, you say anything, it doesn't matter what you say. If you were to say on Facebook that hamburgers are round and they have a patty in between, there would be a bunch of comments that would say, no, that's not true. You're forgetting the Arby's burger. and there would be this like fight. and that fight would probably not result in some kind of, civil discourse. That would probably devolve into something, who knows, maybe somebody get doxxed over like, how do you define a hamburger? If you were to say on Facebook, trucks have beds, somebody's going to like pull up a car that's got a bed. Somebody's going to pull up a truck that doesn't have a bed, and it's going to be this big fight. And this doesn't seem to be a way to actually like transmit language anymore. Because the way that you actually engage in the dialectic is it's a back and forth, and that's not what social media is. It just doesn't work like that. Because I've noticed that like on social media, when I was on it, I would say something and somebody would come in and say like, oh, it's stupid. All black people are this, or all white people are that. And I would just call the guy and I would go, hey, man, look, I know you. Did you really mean that? Like what you just said? And he'd say, no, not really. It's just, and then we would actually have a conversation.
Yeah.
Language seems to be okay. It's just that if we're letting social media dictate how we engage with the rest of the world rather than the other way around, now we got a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue with social media is that everybody's fighting over like linguistic turf, and they just don't give any ground. It's almost like there's no way to really parse terms on social media or in the mass media in general.
Kind of like a linguistic a fight club kind of thing going on. It's like constantly warring over how to use language to beat and win and gain status, right?
Yeah.
And I guess Instagram would be a pictorial version of that, right? TikTok.
But you have the comments section of Instagram, which is like that's where all the problems are.
Yeah. So do you think social media is what's kind of accelerating the dysfunctional relationship problem in a Western context, or at least America?
I mean, I don't think it started with social media. I think it just is a function of mass media.
Yeah.
It is a function of mass media, which like, it's not like mass media started in the 90s. It didn't start with the internet. It's always been. There's always been mass media. And, it's very difficult to recommend policy based on this. I can recommend an ethic, but I can't give policy because like it's really kind of up to the individual to get the hell off that stuff and stop talking like social media and stop talking like mass media and have conversations and actually talk to people. And what you end up with is just this crazy amount of tribalism. And this tribalism is not good. It's not like a healthy form of tribalism because, it starts bleeding out into the real world. And that's not good. That seems to me that it just seems to me that if you're not, then you're just not using language, right?
Right.
Like language is this beautiful thing that solves the unoptimized scenario.
Yeah.
Like language is the resolution to this. There's an example, right? There's an example out there in the wild. These poor things are dead. The Irish elk. The Irish elk had antlers that grew to something like 12 feet in diameter. And the theory is, one of the theories is that females started selecting for bigger and bigger antlers. And for whatever reason, those antlers just started getting bigger. And it wouldn't fall off in time. And that would cause the elk to get caught in brush and they couldn't move around. So the elk went extinct. The Irish elk are gone. So the Irish elk antlers were unoptimized and nothing could sort of save them. We have a scenario where we have an unoptimized combat loop that we're always in anytime we interact with somebody. There's always the potential, at least in your own head, there's always the potential that they have a cousin, they have a weapon, they have access to some kind of, whatever it might be to hurt you. And we have language to resolve that. And if we're using language in a dysfunctional way, then it's just kind of to be expected that we're going to descend down into object-based aggression. We can't have that.
An object-based aggression is what you're talking about, that they have a cousin, that they have a lawyer, that they have a car, that they have a nuclear missile, that they have a gang, right? It's all those others, right? If they have doxing, they have a ability to call your boss and get you fired. Those are all the objects that they can reach for.
Right. And those objects, sometimes it's a matter of like knocking you down a linguistic rung, right? So that you're getting closer now to that magma where you're going to be on the street and now you're going to be subject to these people who are going to go and rob you and take all your money at gunpoint. Nobody wants to be there. because nobody wants to take up a gun and fight that fight. Like there's certain people that can do
are
it.
people really worried about being mugged, or are they just worried about the basic, fear of poverty and survival of the fittest, where you're not sure where you're living and if you're safe? And I mean, you know what I mean? Is it just that? Is it the feeling of being the lowest status on the pecking order of your local economy or culture? Is that really
Yeah,
what's driving it, or is it
there's
fear of the mugging part?
there's probably like that's probably wrapped up in it, right? Like I mean,
Yeah.
fear of hunger is like a real thing. Fear of not having shelter and not having
Is that
water.
is that bigger than the fear of violence? You think fear of hunger and shelter? You would
I
say?
think that, well, I don't know if it's bigger, but it's just as real, right?
Yeah.
But it's not as acute. It takes you a long time to die if you don't have food. It takes you a while to die if you don't have water. It takes you about 35 seconds to die of a gunshot wound.
And the people,
That stuff changes you really quick.
you're right though. The people are afraid of low status because they're afraid of the the untrustworthy relationships that they'll be forced to engage in to mediate that status, right? To be in that status, kind of.
That probably makes sense. Yeah.
I'm just thinking through that in real time what you're getting at.
Like if you were to try and map out what the crises are that have plagued humans since the beginning, they're basically the same crises that plague animals. Same ones, right? Sickness, fertility, famine, animal attacks from other animals, and natural disasters. The only one that we have that animals don't is intraspecific violence. Animals don't kill themselves within their species. They just don't. They think that's not a risk. That is the one
they
thing
do
that we
kill.
have.
Lions will kill cubs and stuff, right?
But that's not a threat to the species.
Yeah, it's just calling
yeah, and that's not combat either. That's more just predation.
Yeah.
With us, combat doesn't just threaten to destroy the two antagonists. It threatens to kill everybody around them too. Yeah. That's why the average person, if there's a fight going on, the average person gets the hell away because it can bleed over to you really easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Animals just don't have this issue. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I would just say then that, yes, of course, these other crises are real, but they're not as acute. They don't hit. I mean, a natural disaster is pretty acute, right? But it's sort of one that you can, we share with animals. It's like, yeah, volcano sucked, right? But with object-based aggression between people, intraspecific violence, that's something that is so catastrophic, and it can just change the entire world.
Well, let's spend some time now exploring some ethical strategies to defer object aggression as much as we possibly can, so that we can have a healthier, higher trust society for everybody.
That sounds great. Where do I start? Talk it out. It's the lame. It does come across as lame, right? Like everybody knows you talk it out, but I think like part of the ethic demands that we acknowledge that. Okay, let me just say one thing before I get into the ethic, because if we're trying to create an ethic on false pretenses, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. The standard model says that language is this cognitive evolution that comes out of humans wanting to communicate, and our ability to use tools comes out of our need to farm and get sustenance and survive. And this is sort of the definition of human evolution now. This is the standard model. And when it comes to aggression is just seen as this base thing at the back of our skulls that comes from chimps. Except when combined with the intelligence, it makes us very deadly and able to detonate a nuclear bomb and blow up the atmosphere or whatever.
Right.
That's the standard model. And if you're trying to make an ethic off of that, then like part of the ethic is like, well, we need to make sure that people get smarter. We need to make sure that we just don't do violence. We need to make sure that, anytime we see like chimp-like aggression, we should stamp it out. And I think that that's like the wrong approach, because I think that model is inverted. I think really what's going on is that the real development was object-based aggression, probably 2.5 million years ago. It could have been when if you want to follow that timeline, whatever the first instance was, when the first human was able to pick up an object and use it for aggression, no other animal does this, only humans do. Chimps will do it for intimidation, but they don't actually stone other chimps to death. They can't like mimic it.
Right.
Humans do and can and will. It's just like, it's mimetic. It's like inevitable that as soon as one person picks up a rock and starts stoning somebody, other people are going to do it. You just don't see it anywhere else. So if the model that we're going to follow, then if we can follow a different model, which is that's what creates language, well, then we need to just be honest about where language comes from, right? And then we need to be honest about what exactly makes us different, and that it's not really like our cognitive development that comes through evolution that makes us different. What makes us different is these things, right? Not physically, but the ability to use these for aggression. So with that said, I think that the universities could really kind of use an operating system update here, so that they would stop talking about violence as though they're outside of it. That would be a first step. That would really help, because the universities tend to be the ones that write about violence. They tend to write the theories, and it tends to be a study of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of these books needs to start off with an apology about how the person writing it is exactly the same as all these other people. They just happen to be higher up in a linguistic, order than these other people, and they, have access to more, linguistic mechanisms that defer violence more easily than the people that they're studying. Right? That would be a nice way to start these books off, and then you can kind of go on with your theory. So I would say that in terms of an ethic for elites, I would say they need to do that. That would be the first thing. As for the average person, I don't think that it's like highly, it's like not a high status thing to talk about your feelings. It's kind of seen as this like, I don't want to use the word, in an idiocracy. It's like, well, you talk like a FAG, and your shit's all fucked up. Like it's just not high status to talk about that stuff. And we talk about World War II and the Greatest Generation. These are guys that didn't talk about the trauma. They didn't talk about it. So it would like remain in this emotional state. When you can convert violence into language, actually you're taking it to a higher order so that you can actually process it. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing. That needs to be done. That is an ethic that should be followed. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be done the way that it's been done. A lot of the time it's sort of seen as this, like, again, it's done from kind of a bad place a lot of the time. But nonetheless, I think that the rule should apply that when you are unable to categorize an event, if you're unable to process something, some kind of violent event, like, work just needs to be done, right? Don't go punch a pillow. Like, that needs to be translated into language. So on like the low end of society, we need like mechanisms in place that can actually translate that stuff into language. And that's part of like why I'm writing the book, is so that these terms and all this stuff that I'm talking about, the stuff that people just live every day and I'm just putting words to, like, that's exactly what I'm doing. And more people should do that, right? More people who are engaged in violence on a day-to-day basis, they should be way more forthright about it. And they just need the terminology. There needs to be like a database that they use, like a glossary. That's easy for them to utilize terms that make sense and actually are concrete about the violence that's going on around them.
So when someone's having a temper tantrum, that's violence, or I mean, like,
yeah, it's potential.
You said if you're
violence, right?
You said don't punch a pillow. Be honest about yourself. What does that look like in reality? Like, what does that look like in a day-to-day moment?
Right. For example, I mean, if you here's a better example.
Somebody cuts you off in traffic, then you hear your big client you got just fired your whole firm,
right?
And then you get screwed over by this or that. You come home, you step in dog poop.
Yep.
And then, what do you do with all that violence?
Yeah. I mean, you'll probably want to punch a pillow first, and that's fine. Right? But don't punch your wife. Don't punch the wall. It's expensive. I've done it. Especially if you hit a beam. Like, here's another example, right? There is this like very standard mode that people use to deal with living in a technological society, where everything's mechanized, everything is very sort of ritualized for the company and not for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
The company is sort of like arrested the ritual process, and the individual is just sort of like expected to go about this on a day-to-day basis with a certain, ticking time and get it done, and then they get paid. And what they do with that money is they can then cope with the fact that they're totally separated from like real, living, so to speak, right? And so there's a coping process that you engage in, where all of the resentments and desires that you kind of build up on a day-to-day basis within, industrial society, you just sort of find an outlet for that in mass media. And mass media is there, and it's free and it's easy. And then there's like a very quick and easy link that you can click on to buy a thing that's going to come to your door within 4 hours. And that's like an outlet for this stuff. And that doesn't solve it either, because like those resentments are just going to pile up the next day too. And at a certain point, like those outlets aren't going to work anymore. Those dopamine hits are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You're going to need more and more stuff. If you run out of money to buy that stuff, like what happens then, right? So this is like suicide rates and all this is like a very real byproduct of these things. So it's not simply about talking it out. It's about, having a firm understanding of how exactly resentments and violence and language all kind of interact within the human psyche. And if we're just not on a good footing there, like we're just going to kind of keep going down the same like spiraling process.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, punching a pillow is probably fine. It's not fair to knock on. No, I'm not ragging on the pillow punchers out there. But in terms of like the final goal of it, without actual like introspection and without actual work, linguistic work, you're probably just going to keep going back to that abusive job or the abusive relationship,
Right.
And that's not good.
How does prayer or any other thing to help with this, or is there anything else you'd like to put in there besides what I suggested, prayer there?
I think anytime you're able to externalize what's going on so that you realize that probably two things. The first thing is that like you yourself probably can't change yourself. There has to be an event that changes you. And maybe that's a religious conviction on my part. I don't know, but I'm not convinced that you can talk to yourself and change yourself. I think that you get changed via other bigger things that nobody can really control, right? Just like I don't think that you can change anybody's mind. I think that a person has to be in a state for their mind to want to be changed. Mm-hmm. So if you don't change their mind, then somebody else will. So anytime you're able to externalize and sort of admit that like you are only, this is what prayer ultimately does, right? And this is what psychotherapy does. This is what exorcism does. Jean-Michel Orgoylian, his Puppet of Desire book, like lays this out mechanically, beautifully, which is that if you can externalize whatever the big intent load is in your brain, if you can externalize that, then somebody can pull it out and like unravel it and actually go behind and show like, hey, this is actually why you have anxiety. This is why you're depressed, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of the time prayer probably has that effect, right? Where if you can actually, if you seriously mean it, and you seriously mean that I don't have a way to actually resolve this, I need something from the outside to get behind this thing. And if you really mean that, then like that's when you have these real conversion moments.
Very good. Eric, when does your book, The Art of Violence, come out? When is it going to be available?
Oh, I'm really hoping that it comes out by the end of 2024. That's my goal.
So about a year from now then. Okay.
Yeah, I'm still doing research right now.
Well, very good. And where can people stay in touch with you in the meantime? Since you don't use social media, what's the best way to stay abreast of what you've got cooking with your thoughts?
EricJacobus.com is my website. I have a YouTube channel, so that is quasi social media, I admit. Eric Jacobus Official on YouTube. That's where my podcast is, and I post there too about latest updates with the book. So,
final question: do you think that is another healthy outlet for maintaining, like cathartic release from violence would be participation in, martial arts or like things like that. Are those healthy outlets for dealing with the magma of society?
I think that what that does is it codifies violence into something that's like more linguistic than object-based aggression.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you can add form to something that's kind of formless, like real violence doesn't look like martial arts. It's horrific. And so anytime you can form it, it becomes a language, and you sort of grammarize movement in that way. And I'm a big fan of that. And what that allows you to do as a person, you may not even have verbal terms for the things that you're doing in your martial art class, but you have these sort of shapes, you have this geometry, you have like a physical language about what you're doing. And that allows you to kind of see movement and violence very differently. Not just when it happens, but you can see it coming. You can see when somebody has a certain, intent to harm. Martial arts has a way of like teaching you what that looks like, and you don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it'll bring you to the fringe. It'll kind of show you what that's like,
mm-hmm.
right? By putting you into a sparring situation. Again, this is within a linguistic framework, but it'll sort of show you like a virtualized version of real violence so that you can kind of see what real intent to harm looks like.
Right.
And then you process through it, right? And the way you process through it is that after you and your sparring partner bow to each other at the end, you shake hands, you're going to go, have lunch together afterward. Then that allows you to really like decouple violence from emotion. So violence then gets moved into the rationality part of the brain. And that allows you to then look around you in a better way, and actually see for yourself, you can possibly see violence around the corner in a way that you wouldn't have seen it before. Best part about being a martial artist is that you get into less fights as a result.
Yeah. Well, very good, Eric. So,
you should anyway. If you're getting in more fights because of martial arts, you should change schools.
Eric, thank you for your time. It's been a great time talking with you, and
thanks, David.
Very interesting material, and I look forward to seeing where you take it in the next year.
All right. Thanks.
Take care. And again, if you want to stay in touch with us, you can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.